Great, thanks, Tony. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today on this nice chilly winter day. I'm based in Melbourne today, actually, for a conference put on by the Attorney General, but I've ducked out to be with you today. So it's a great privilege to be sharing with you. And as mentioned, we're going to be going into the bits of the nuts and bolts of actually assessing modern slavery risk. This may or may not be something which is you've been asked to do as a non-reporting entity, but certainly is a feature of organisations who do need to comply with the Modern Slavery Act. And we are seeing a trend in the market where smaller entities, those in the B2B supply space, are needing to actually do more to at least understand where they're buying the products from, and to actually start the process of actually doing modern slavery due diligence. The first step in terms of supply chains is to actually understand how to identify modern slavery risk and what is it that we're looking for. So today, that's what we're about today, and what I want to run us through in the next hour that we have together. Just going to share my screen so that you can actually see what it is that we're looking at. There we go, perfect. Great. So just a little bit of background in case you're not sure. I run Unchained Solutions, and we inspire Australian organisations to be leaders in making impact on modern slavery. And we really see the Modern Slavery Act at a Commonwealth level as something that is a really good vehicle for many organisations, both large and small, and we want to see that implemented across the board. And it's also a mechanism which can be transferred into other impact areas. We're a social enterprise in the sense that we give a portion of our profit, to ending modern slavery, including the funding of other social enterprises through the Freedom Business Alliance, organisations that work directly with the survivors of modern slavery, especially those that are concentrated in Southeast Asia. We offer a turnkey solution comprising 5 solution areas: strategy, analysis, training, documents, and research. And under them, we have a number of services which we can offer at a bespoke level to our clients, depending on their level of maturity. And we have certain products that we do recommend for smaller players to start working on, which will help them to be in alignment with their the requests of their corporate clients. So today I want to just touch on briefly what is the risk of modern slavery. It's always good to touch base on that and the impact of the legislation, and then really get into the nuts and bolts of conducting a risk assessment, the what of the risk, the where, and the how. So that's the main thrust of actually what we're focusing on, and I want to get there as quickly as possible because we have a lot of information to unpack. We'll then do a summary of key learnings and an opportunity, as Tony mentioned, to ask questions. So let's get into the risk of modern slavery. I did mention this last time, but it's always good to come back to this question. It is 10 years now since the collapse of the Rana Plaza in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And it's really important date really in the calendar, or reminding ourselves really of the severity of the situation in which we're faced in our world today as a consequence of the demands that we put on other countries and factory owners to produce the goods and services in the time and the quality that we actually expect. This incident occurred back in April 2013 when a factory collapsed, killing over 1,100 women working in the apparel sector, which is a sector in alignment with the promotional products industry. So here we have a situation in which women were making garments, and their freedoms were of various levels. But we know that during the day of this collapse 10 years ago, that the women were forced back into the building, although complaints had been made around the safety of that building. And building safety really is a key indicator of modern slavery risk, the environment in which people work. And this in terms of safety, in terms of air quality, food quality, sanitation, waste management, water management. These environmental concerns play into are a key component of us identifying modern slavery risk, because they really point to the dignity or the lack thereof that we place, and the value we place on people working in those facilities and how we care for them. Architecture plays a very key role, important role in livability and enabling us to thrive in work and in life. And where that is lacking, it can actually demonstrate a lack of care and concern for the lifestyle, the life of those who are working in those contexts. And really the question being asked today, 10 years down the track, now, have we done enough? Particularly not just in the apparel sector, but across a number of industries. The spotlight has broadened to a number of industries now. Are we doing enough, and have we done enough to actually protect the rights of people working in certain contexts? And are we in a sense making sure that we're not just profiting off others people in their situations? Are we doing enough to actually make sure that there is a universal application of human rights, regardless of where people are born and where they live and work in this world today? And that really points to the dynamic of modern slavery. According to Unseen UK, modern slavery is the commodification of people for the purpose of exploitation and financial gain. And in this global economy and this world of consumerism, where we have the tendency to commodify everything, including the value of people, that can actually then lead to situations where we devalue people in order to secure our own financial freedom, our own financial security. And so this is where commodification of these people for exploitation and financial gain is really a very key summary really of what we're looking at in terms of what is modern slavery. At an acute level, modern slavery is the removal or the severe restriction of a person's choice, voice, and movement. The lack of agency and the removal of that agency is a key component where a person doesn't have the right to speak out, the right to move, the right to make choices. That's really what we're looking at in terms of the concept of a contemporary form of slavery. At a legislative level, this modern slavery is being applied in the Australian context. There are two pieces of legislation here, both at the Commonwealth and the state level for New South Wales. Both have modern slavery acts, and there are different dynamics in terms of the provisions of those legislations. But there are very, very key sort of areas or the faces of modern slavery under the rubric of those terms, of those two terms, or those pieces of legislation. Forced labour, servitude, debt bondage, extreme forms of child labour, forced marriage, and human trafficking. These are all faces of modern slavery risk. They're at the extreme end of exploitation. And if we think of modern slavery sitting on a continuum, then this is kind of at the extreme end of the dynamic of free and unfree, and they all work in together. There are many indicators that point to a case of modern slavery, and they include a big list there. This is not conclusive, but some of the key indicators that we see. And I've already mentioned one today being the unsafe workplace, which is certainly the case in the situation of the Rana Plaza. But there are a number of key dynamics involved in the issue of modern slavery. In terms of the scope, there's been some recent reports put out both by the International Labour Organization, and this year the Global Slavery Index put out a new report, and that's changed the figures. We could probably in one sense see that the numbers have increased. We've moved from 40 million to 50 million, and there are some 26 million just in the Asia Pacific region, the region in which we operate and source most of our goods and services. The biggest category remains forced labour in factories, farms, and fisheries. And modern slavery is very much a gender issue, affecting where the number of people impacted are women and girls. So this is where modern slavery does intersect very much so with the attention that we need to be paying towards gender equality. The case numbers are up in Australia. We're up to from 18 to 41,000. Now, whether or not that's that the numbers have increased or that we've actually got better clarity on the numbers here in Australia, we can say, I think, with all the figures that these are conservative numbers, and I think the situation is much worse than what we've actually been able to capture so far in terms of our research, given the hiddenness of the issue. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not just talking about apparel. Modern slavery impacts quite any number of industries, and we're actually getting more information now and understanding of different areas. For example, ICT, so computer device technologies, and here we have an intersection with our environmental concerns as well. in terms of energy use. A lot of research has been done in terms of fisheries. And out of the pandemic, a lot of work was done in terms of understanding risks in PPE and many of the medical equipment and pharmaceuticals that we needed during the COVID era. So as we journey through different dynamics in the market, we're really getting greater clarity in terms of where the risks are and a greater transparency, which is what we need to address this issue. How does legislation play into this? Well, legislation does have a key role. It's not a conclusive role, but here in Australia, we have at the Commonwealth level, the Modern Slavery Act, which many of your corporate clients will be complying with. And there are really three key concepts to think of when it comes to addressing this piece of legislation. The first is around transparency, and that's very much about what we're talking about today. Identifying risk. What does it mean to identify risk in the entire value chain? And that's a very key component that organizations need to be transparent about, transparent with themselves, as well as transparent with the federal government through the Australian Border Force, and registering their statement so that anyone in society can actually see what they're doing. That transparency piece is not finished. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Once we've identified risk, we also then need to take responsibility for that risk. That's even harder work of actually putting in place mechanisms that will actually address the risks, making sure those responsible actions could be preventative, making sure that we've got the right governance framework in place, that we've actually got the right policies and procedures in place, but also that we've thought through issues around grievance mechanisms, remediation, and actually making sure that we're doing all that we can to drill down to the source of our products and services to understand the context of risk so that we can actually identify what it is that we're actually looking at and how we can actually affect change. And all this is bundled up into the word effectiveness, where organizations don't just need to sort of do things because that's what their competitors are doing, but actually do things in a way that they can measure the impact and really think through their business ecosystem and to create a impact measurement framework so that they can actually register what's actually changing, whether that's at a quantitative or a qualitative level, what kind of impact are they making through all this activity so that we can actually see that progress is actually being made. Great quote from Nolan and Bersma. Modern slavery sits on a continuum of exploitation. It should not and cannot be addressed in isolation. In our bid to manage, reduce, and eliminate modern slavery, we need to first acknowledge the larger contextual problems from which it emerges. We should treat the symptoms and the causes. And that's a very short way of saying that actually addressing this issue is not a short-term endeavor. We need to have very clear goals, we need to have very clear strategies, and we need to allocate enough resources and funding and investment to actually do the work of due diligence and not be satisfied until we've actually made sure that we do have the right level of transparency and traceability and have actually implemented and done the due diligence work. So this is a big enterprise and a lot of big companies are struggling, they're challenged by this, but with every challenge is an opportunity. And the more that we move in this space and integrate modern slavery due diligence along with other ESG reporting mechanisms into our business, the more that we will have a greater impact in our world and operate in a responsible manner. So what is it? So today let's hone in on the issue of assessing risk, and we're going to start with the what, the strategy, and the approach. Well, when it comes to some key dynamics in the what of modern slavery risk, really what we're talking about here is assessing the risk to people versus the risk to business. We live in a world in which many business owners are very conscious of the risks to their business, and rightly so. But when we're thinking about addressing issues of human rights due diligence, what we're thinking of is not just what is this actually going to mean in terms of my own reputation, for example, or there may also be legal and other risks too, in terms of financial risks. When we're thinking about addressing risk, we're really about thinking about risks to those who are impacted in the space. Another key dynamic in terms of assessing risk is actually really working out and developing the right approach. And there are two main trains of thought. We can take a risk-based approach or a spend-based approach, depending on the size of our supply chain. Many large organizations who have thousands of suppliers might, in a sense, start with a spends-based approach to segment their supply chain, because it's difficult to concentrate on everything at all at once, and to actually approach the risk by spend, dealing with the largest amounts of spend, and then working through their suppliers. However, that needs to be matched with a risk-based approach, because just the biggest areas of spend are not necessarily going to be where all the risks are, and the risk could actually be in the smaller spend areas with the smaller suppliers. And so that's why we need to take into account those two areas. The two main areas of risk that we need to take into account is risk by country and category, or industry risks. So we need to consider the country of origin of where those products are coming from. And we also then need to think about risks embedded within the production of those products themselves, and the type of supply chain associated with the manufacturing of that product. Another component is really to think about the purpose of assessing risk. You might just think, oh, well, we'll do a risk assessment because we'll do a risk assessment, but actually doing a risk assessment has purpose, and it really needs to tie in with the overall business strategy for reform and remedy. So that's what we're doing assessing risk for, is to actually look for areas of improvement and where we might provide remedy to those who are impacted by our business activities. And all this requires setting appropriate goal setting, executive sponsorship, and resourcing of teams and capacity building. It employs the use of data. We need to have good data sets. Some of those data sets are likely to be historic in nature, but they enable us to point to where we need to do some more work. And we need to have a framework to measure the impact and collect the data. So use data that's out there, and also work out a way for us to collect our own data. And finally, addressing modern slavery risk is really a dynamic between the science and art, the science of data analysis and the art of stakeholder-based analysis. So we can't just rely on raw data to do all the work, because data will only provide a general hypothetical view of what we're looking at. We also need to match that with the interpersonal collaborative approach, actually working with people to build capacity and identify and work with them to actually build better systems and put in better processes in place to strengthen and build resilient supply chains. So there's a lot in the what. We're just breaking down just in terms of risk by country and category. This is probably the main risk matrix, and really what we're looking for in developing a risk assessment is to develop a risk profile for suppliers. And you may have already, for you, some of your corporate clients may already have a risk profile for you. That profile will be a combination of country and category risks by and large. And both of those two things will have similar but different areas or different indicators. So in terms of country risk, we're looking at internal conflicts, internally displaced people, disenfranchised groups, the lack of a social safety net, the judicial system, basic needs, the state of enforced labour, women's physical security, and political instability. They all play into the concept of country risk. And on the category risk, then it's more about the actual how business is conducted. So the use of deceptive recruitment practices or child labour, the unregulated workforce, employee rights, representation, abuse in the workplace, withholding of wages, debt bondage, all those indicators that I mentioned earlier in the presentation today. So this is kind of what it means. This is the what of modern slavery risk. In all this, though, in terms of the data sources, there are a number of credible data sources that we need to consider. Some of them are quite sizable and extensive, but organizations will be drawing upon the International Labour Organization, the Global Slavery Index. Both have updated their own databases. A good standard is put out by the UN SPSC in terms of actually the categorization of suppliers that will help us then to identify where the risks are by country and category. And there are other data lists that we can, authorities that we can draw on. And for us here at Unchained, we use also our own expertise to put together and build out a risk profile for each of our clients, suppliers and entities that they're working with. So that's part of the what of what we're looking at and what we're dealing with. If we move on then to consider the where of modern slavery risk. And here I want us to consider the concept of the entire value chain. When we're thinking about risks, the immediate thought can be that we need to actually conduct a risk assessment, and that the emphasis here is that risk is by and large going to be all embedded within our supply chain, whether that's those who are working with directly or those who we are working with indirectly. In the context of Australia, we do have risks, as I've mentioned before, but by and large, most of the risks in terms of the products and services that organizations are procuring are going to be abroad, overseas, and that in a sense is a major challenge for organizations to create the right strategy to actually get the verification in different parts of our world. And there's there are challenges all through that entire process as companies look to identify risk throughout their supply chain. So that is a big category, which is why it sits there down at the bottom. It is probably the largest category, but there are other categories that organizations need to consider, and they have to do more with the operational side of the organization. So, for example, there are risks related to facilities and the servicing of those facilities. A lot of work and a lot of risk in Australia, for example, has to do with around cleaning contracts and the subcontracting that goes with that industry, similar to security and the maintenance of those services. And so that's a very key area of operations that organizations need to consider. The second area of operations has to do with the employee expenses themselves, and this is where companies procure technology and uniforms and PPE and make travel arrangements. So this is an area of risk for organizations as they think through what are the kind of services and provisions that they're using in order for the actual workforce themselves that they need to consider. And finally, there's risks on the financial level. And this is a big area, is around thinking through risks to do with investors, both investors and investments and joint ventures. So large organizations in particular need to start thinking about how in terms of capital, how that capital is raised, and the kind of industries that money is poured into in order to raise capital. That all is an area of risk that organizations need to consider. So when we think about modern slavery risk, it is, in a sense, the big category, and probably the priority will be around the supply chain, but there are other areas of risk that organizations need to consider as well. And then we come down to the question of the how. And this is probably the biggest area that we'll be covering off today. The dynamics of assessing modern slavery risk. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip of water, a bit croaky today. So when it comes to the how and we're looking at the dynamics of risk. We've gone through the what and we've gone through the where, but looking at the how. Well, there are a number of tools and a number of processes that organizations will deploy in order to help them to both assess and verify risks and build them out. And there's no right or wrong way with this. These are sort of the very key and classic ways in which organizations have applied themselves to help build out the risk profile for their entire supply chain and value chain. The first has to do with categorization, which I mentioned in the what, to make sure that suppliers are categorized correctly, segmented, and a risk profile is developed for each of those suppliers, and that will help an organization to identify what are the next steps in working with that client. That would lead on naturally to a supplier engagement strategy, and there are a number of supplier engagement tools that can be applied and used to enable the continuation of that dynamic. Going deeper, there's the question around, there's tools around transparency and traceability. And this is where we're looking at a more sort of, instead of going broad in our supply chain, we're actually going deep and narrow and deep. This is where we might look to drill down certain product lines to actually get down to the source of manufacturing or the source of harvesting of raw materials to actually get the clarity that we need. In the mix of all this then is the dynamic of auditing and third-party verification schemes that are on offer. A key component in terms of improvement is around credentials and certifications, which enable organizations to lift their game even before they've been assessed for risk, that they're actually taking proactive approaches to be self-assessed and to meet certain standards, industry standards. And a key component also of risk assessment is around understanding the role of partnerships and collaboration. And this is where we need to sort of step out of classic business dynamics or strategy around being highly competitive. We need to, and when it comes to addressing issues of risk in the social and environmental space, there's a lot of value in partnering with other organizations and developing key strategies with either government or civil society groups or even suppliers or peers to actually help build the leverage to make the appropriate investments. So the investment could be such that you need to work in partnership, and this is perhaps something that needs to be considered for APPA. How can suppliers, for example, be working together to actually build out and respond to the demands that are being placed upon you by corporate clients? So let's just go further into those areas. When it comes to supplier categorization, how this works is that an organization will take a look at the spend data from accounting, for example, and who are we spending money with, and where is all that money going, and who is in our supply chain. And this is all around mapping the supply chain. And so this is all laid out, and then the next step would be to categorize those suppliers. We use the UNSPSC coding to actually get a really granular understanding of where those suppliers sit and where their products sit in terms of the different types of classes of products that they're actually offering. And that will help us to identify where those risks are going to be, both in terms of country and category. So we'll assign commodity, class, family, and segments. That comes out of the UNSPSC. And then the next step would be then to assign the industry risk per category using those external sources. And then we would segment where the risks are going to be low, medium, high based on that information. Then we'll create a client spend assessment matrix, which will then give really some high level as well as a more granular level understanding of the types of risks, where those risks are by country, category, and what is happening at the direct supply level, and what is actually maybe happening at the indirect supply level, where they actually need to apply more due diligence activities. So this is not due diligence, this is the setup, if you like, for the actual due diligence. And the goal of this is really to create a risk matrix of the entire supplier base. So that's really in a nutshell supplier categorization and segmentation. And here we have, if you said this, we can break that up into 4 stages. categorization, reviewing the risk level, assessing and prioritizing, and then creating an action plan and a timeline to engage with suppliers and work out how we can, what leverage we have to engage with certain suppliers. And this is a really important step because once you've actually assessed risk, you really need to think through, well, what leverage do we have and who can we actually work with and where can we go? And a very good example of this be if you're in the middle of the market, you might have some suppliers that are much bigger than you. They could be a telco or a bank, and it could be there's actually no point doing much there except to really just see what they're actually saying. If Australia Post or Telstra Optus or one of the big four banks might just say, well, look, go to our website, you can actually see our sustainability page and all the activities that we're doing. You're not going to get much leverage. So part of the activity of the risk assessment is to actually work out where we can actually affect change, who can we collaborate with, who in the supply chain is high risk, and where can we apply our energy and resources. You may come to the conclusion after the initial risk assessment is that there are some suppliers that are in a high risk category and there's not much we can do. The best thing we can do is actually employ our ethical policy portfolio and actually, in a sense, work out how we can actually change suppliers and source products elsewhere because we actually can't do much to push or to affect change in that area of risk. So that's all part of the dynamic, all part of the sort of the art, if you like, of addressing modern slavery risk using the science of modern slavery risk. Just more briefly then, this is the UNSPSC model, and there's a hierarchy and a codification. So there's over 150,000 codes, and this is updated annually to help organizations organize their procurement data. The risk matrix is on the two axes. So we've got country risk and category risk. And this helps us to work out where for example, where the country risk and the category risk is low, then we're looking at low, medium, and then into the high categories. So this helps us to map out and present our data and organize our data so that we can actually strategize where we actually need to apply change. Where do we need to affect change? When it comes to the next step, we're looking at supplier engagement. So once we've actually mapped our suppliers, we've segmented into low, medium, high, then we need to think about, okay, well, who do we need to, in that supply base, who do we need to work with? Who do we need to engage with more effectively? And this comes under the banner of a supplier engagement strategy. And again, there are some key principles that we need to apply here. We advocate for a collaborative approach here. And what we mean by that is that one of the tensions, and maybe you've experienced this yourself as a B2B supplier, is that you just get issued with a self-assessment questionnaire, an SAQ, and you just need to fill that in and send it back to the supplier, to your corporate client, and you have no idea whether or not what they've done with that information and if they're going to act on that information. It's been proven to be very inefficient, especially as many suppliers receive multiples of these on any given week, answering the same questions. And so one of the key strategies for those issuing SAQs is to actually work in partnership with others who share a common pool of suppliers so that suppliers aren't inundated with an excessive amount of SAQs, which pulls them away from actually doing business. A key component and some good practices, though, for a more effective SAQ process is to actually embed within that process some capacity building. And for example, start the process with a workshop. We've done this, and I've got an example here with one of our clients. It was an Australian-based charity, so they're voluntarily opting in to report under the Modern Slavery Act, sitting around the $25 to $40 million mark. They engage with a number of merchandise suppliers based in South Asia, so Nepal, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, areas of high risk. Their first SAQ to 11 suppliers resulted in 3 responses. when we started working with them, we then say, well, let's actually start with a supplier workshop. Let's bring those suppliers together virtually. We did that virtually. And that then gave an opportunity for the charity to articulate what was the rationale, why are we doing this, what we're trying to do as a reporting entity, because we're now doing that, we're voluntarily opting in. This is what we'd like you to do. Let's walk through the SAQ. This is how you best understand. What are your questions? And really start the conversation, start this from a more conversational approach, so that they can actually understand what they're actually asking. And from that process, they got 11 out of 11 responses, which enabled the organization to have a much more effective strategy following through this process. It provides the opportunity for increased leverage, to provide incentives for suppliers, as well as develop resilience. So that's a good case study. Some of those tools that can be employed are, well, there's training products, so capacity building, the SAQ, which will vary in size and intensity. Supplier code of conduct. It's also good to have that, to present that and walk organizations through that, so people know what the standards are and what they're actually agreeing to. And that all will be articulated in a vendor agreement. It's important to set up a reporting framework with suppliers. So it's not just, assessing modern slavery risk is not a one-off agenda, it's ongoing. And so setting up a scenario where there's an expectation that suppliers will be reporting in, whether that's every 12 months or 2 years. And for those suppliers, for example, that don't have all their ducks lined up in a row, it provides an opportunity for corrective action, so suppliers can actually step up and put in place policies and procedures that they're being asked to put in. And this all can be managed through SaaS platforms to actually manage the suppliers and their own processes and procedures that they need to put in place. Moving on from there is the concept of auditing and third-party verification, which you also may be familiar with. Here we have some good examples. One is a process. There's organizations like Kima that are based in Hong Kong, who can put boots on the ground in 95 countries and run all manner of audits, not just on human rights, but also on quality. And that can be a very good, effective approach to approach human rights due diligence and environmental through the lens of quality assurance, so that it's less confronting for suppliers and factory owners in those places where you're actually sourcing products and services. And then there's the 4 pillars of SMETA, of a SMETA audit that can also be employed both in Australia and overseas as well. And third-party verification, again, is not a perfect process, and there's a whole lot of dynamics around, spot audits as well as scheduled audits, but it all helps you to build a picture and in terms of actually identifying and assessing and verifying those risks. Another area to consider also is around certifications, credentials. An organization, an AI platform which has emerged over the last few years that we're in partnership with is Givable. And here Givable provide a snapshot of suppliers and in terms of the different credentials, attributes, and certifications that they have. And big corporates are beginning to use these kind of platforms to actually screen their suppliers in advance to see what they're saying about themselves in terms of a broader ESG framework. And it can be a tool, again, another tool to start a conversation with suppliers to say, well, we can see that you're rating well in this area, but in order to continue doing business with you, we'd like you to consider doing some due diligence in this area as well to improve your rating, improve your credentials, which are being generated through AI on a platform like Givable. Well, as we come to a close, and I'm mindful of some questions are coming through, which is great, and I just want to get to those questions. When we look at step back a bit and we think about all the types of activities that can be done to assess risk, really what we need to make sure that we have in place is a really clear strategy, because none of this work can be done overnight. It can be labor intensive. And so company organizations, regardless of their size, really need to start thinking through how we can map this out. And here we have a sample implementation roadmap. And what we often recommend, what we do recommend to our corporate clients, to help them to think through what they could be doing in year 1, in year 2, in year 3, and year 4 to build out the risk management framework, recognizing that they've got other work they need to do, and there's other impact areas they need to consider, how they can integrate those impact areas and build out their risk management profile over a number of years. And this will enable them to demonstrate continuous improvement in the reporting mechanism. And suppliers in the B2B space have a very key role in doing this and could employ some of these elements themselves. So in terms of what we've considered today, I think it's very safe to say that assessing modern slavery risk is a complex endeavor. There's lots that organizations need to consider. And that requires, some very clear thinking around goal setting and strategy and the allocation of resources. There's also the scope of the analysis. A primary focus really has to do with the supply of goods and services, but there's also other areas of analysis that you might need to consider. And then going forward is really thinking through the depth of that analysis. And as organizations set the right foundations, it then sets them up in a sense to work out where they can go deeper and to get the verification and the clarity they need, which will enable them to be more effective in putting in place grievance mechanisms and remediation strategies as well. Again, this coming back to the previous slide, this all needs to be mapped out over a long period of time to ensure that organizations have the capacity build to do this, because that's a big key issue, and that they have a strategy and a framework that they can track their progress and demonstrate that to their corporate clients, who will be looking to see, and increasingly so, what their suppliers in Australia are doing to address issues like modern slavery. So I just want to pause there and look at some of these questions that are coming in. All right. Well, they're not really questions, so just that someone needs to go, so that's fine. But I do invite anyone here to, if you want to ask any questions based on what we've presented today. I know there's been a lot to consider. Perhaps you're at a point where you haven't really been asked to do this at this stage, but it's something you need to think about, however small your supply base may be. We have seen a trend of, as I've mentioned in previous workshops and webinars, there is a trend where organizations are asking more from their suppliers. And well, my pushback to those corporates is to make sure that they're also providing the capacity and the tools and resources to enable their suppliers to answer the questions that they want answered. But it's also important for APPA members in your industry to actually understand what it is that companies are actually wanting to do, particularly in assessing risk, and perhaps what role you can play in helping that endeavor, as well as contributing to that endeavor as well, because assessing modern slavery risk is complex and it does require a multi-stakeholder based approach. So anyway, I just want to see if there's any more questions.
Looks like people are a little bit shy to ask questions. But just to answer that question earlier, will the presentation be available? Yes, we will send the presentation and the video in a few days. You'll also find, as members, The presentation will be on our APPA website for reference, just like all the other three prior to this one are also on our APPA website, if you need to reference it again.
Great, thanks, Tony. All right, well, you might have some more questions, and I do welcome the opportunity to meet and talk them through. As has been said in previous webinars, Unchained, in their partnership with APPA, have enabled members to access two key resources. One has to do with training in the form of e-learning modules, and those modules are available individually, can be purchased individually and as a package price with a discount for APPA members. And all these modules, the first one is the key one around awareness and personal consumer choices. But as we move through, we get into more detail in terms of especially what we've talked today is all really embedded in module 3, identifying, managing modern slavery risks, but some modules there around policies and measuring effectiveness and going further with the implementation. The other offer that's also standing has to do with our policies. So we have a number of templates that are available for purchase as well. They can be purchased again individually or as a package price. And we can provide those templates for you to customize for your own use. If you need assistance as well in terms of customizing them, we can also provide services in addition to the price here to help you to implement them. We do a lot of work with organizations around modern slavery position statements, is the main document that organizations need. And so, yeah, we make that available in a template format for APPA members. Similarly, also that you can access us and be in contact with us. I'm very happy to meet with anyone if they want to discuss their needs around this issue. And you can access and set up a time with me using that QR code that'll link you to Linktree, and which will then give you access to all the sorts of socials and ways you can connect with me. And you can set up a time if you like to meet with me. Yeah, I can offer a 15-minute free consultation to anyone who wants to discuss their needs further. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and yeah, and if there's no more questions, we can wrap up our session today.
Awesome, Stephen, as usual. Just also, there is an article that I've noticed on SBS News published 2 days ago on modern slavery in Australia. So if those are interested, they can have a look at that online.
Perfect.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I'll just double